My next guest is on a mission to help what he calls rewilding our cities, ourselves, and our societies. Christopher Brown is the author of A Natural History of Empty Lots, Field Notes from Urban Edgelands, Back Alleys, and Other Wild Places. And Christopher joins me now to explain what this is all about. Welcome to New Day.
Thanks for having me on, Kelly.
Yes, so why did you write this new book?
I wanted to figure out a way to share the things I'd learned in 20 years I spent exploring, documenting, and even living in the wild parts of our cities. And I wanted to try to write a different kind of nature writing. I had written novels before, but I want to write a kind of nature writing that helps people find a fresh way to connect with wild nature and each other through the urban lens.
Amazing. And you write about an edgeland. What is that?
Edgeland is a term invented by an English ecologist to describe these kinds of places where wild nature finds a way to manifest itself inside the city, often at the edges, whether it's the actual outer periphery of the city or empty lots, the spaces, between two roads, things like that. And in this landscape of the North American landscape, we don't really have a term we use to describe that. We don't talk about those kinds of spaces a lot. We tend to be very focused on wilderness excursions, going to the outfitters and gearing up to go off to the frontier, to the true wilderness area. And we tend to ignore how much wild nature really exists inside the urban environment. And paying attention to those kinds of places is a really important way to open ourselves up to what's already around us.
Amazing. And you touched on, this isn't your first book, but how did you become interested in exploring such spaces and wanting to get this out?
I'd always my whole life been, gravitated toward the outdoors like so many of us. But when I found myself as a young dad was when I really started wanting to find these kinds of wild spaces as they exist in the city. And I had this little kid who, like many children, had a natural sense of wonder at the natural world, both in the epic sense and the very micro sense at the little bugs and flowers around us. And so we were living in a little garage apartment at the end of a dead-end street, and it was like, well, why don't we go to the other end of the cul-de-sac, go right past where the street ends and see what we can find. And lo and behold, like in any city, you find little creek beds, you find tadpoles, you find wild, weird birds, and we found, coyotes roaming around behind rail yards, and so started to actively explore these kinds of places over a period of years, and then ended up living in one.
I know, I want to talk about that. What made you decide to rewild your own home?
Well, I wanted to figure out, I had been with my son and alone exploring these wild urban spaces for years, and I was like, well, this is really fun. It really makes life feel more vivid, more real. I want to find a way to why can't I live like that, right?
Right.
And so I looked around and I found this kind of extreme, Texas is where I live, example of an empty lot, an urban acre between a factory and a river bisected with an old petroleum pipeline. And figure out a way to, buy that land, get the oil company to take the pipeline out, build a little eco bunker house in the ditch that was left after the pipeline was gone, and then rewild it, working with experts on how to restore the native landscape of the place where we lived to create like a biodiverse prairie on our roof and in our yard. And there's similar examples of projects like that here and elsewhere, in lots of spaces where you can find these little stretches of wild urban river next to Superfund sites where astonishingly they have kind of naturally rewilded all by themselves. And if you do it on purpose, you can really achieve amazing things.
That's so interesting. I know, I want to talk about why you think such projects are so important.
I mean, I think that these kinds of projects are really critical when you think about the biodiversity crisis we're dealing with on a planetary basis and on a local basis. I don't want to get into the numbers, they're too scary, but I think we're all aware of it. And learning to see how much wild nature is already around us, learning to understand how important these kinds of wild spaces that are in the cities are in providing habitat for other life, plant and animal life, and figuring out ways to bring that back into urban life on an everyday basis is a critical way to go about sort of finding our own fresh connections with the natural world and figuring out how to live in better balance with nature and with each other.
Is that what you want the takeaway to be then when someone reads your book?
Yeah, I want them to find out that, with just a little bit of exploration, without having to get in your car and drive everywhere, you can find majestic, wild nature, very close to where you are, wherever you are. And you can do things to cultivate it in your own yard, whether it's a balcony, whether it's a regular all-American backyard, or a little guerrilla gardening like a friend of mine who has rewilded a patch of dirt under the M train in Queens, New York, planting native flowers, and there's a lot of ways you can do it.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing about your new book. And just a reminder, Christopher is holding an author event tonight, Thursday, November 21st at the Elliott Bay Book Company on Seattle's Capitol Hill at 7 p.m.